Power, privilege, wealth. These are the weapons that some use to elevate themselves by diminishing others. In a world where financial success is often mistaken for moral superiority, those at the top of the economic ladder can sometimes forget the fundamental truth that binds us all, our shared humanity. This is the story of a collision between two worlds, one represented by Maxwell Harrington, a tech billionaire whose fortune was built on predicting human behavior through algorithms and data. A man accustomed to deference, to rooms falling silent when he speaks, to never having his assumptions challenged, and the other represented by Sarah Collins, a single mother working 3 jobs to provide for her daughter and to fund her dream of completing her education. A woman whose intelligence and dignity remained undiminished by circumstance, whose resilience had been forged in the crucible of real-world challenges that no amount of wealth could ever comprehend. They were never meant to meet, these two. Their orbits shouldn't have intersected, but on one fateful evening at a prestigious university's fundraising gala, they did, with explosive consequences that would transform them both and everyone who witnessed their encounter. Welcome to a true story of humiliation turned to triumph, of arrogance faced with authentic strength, and of a moment when the artificial barriers of class and status came crashing down in a revelation of what truly matters. Today, we invite you to witness what happens when privilege meets principle, when condescension faces conviction, and how a single moment of truth can change not just 2 lives, but an entire community's perspective on success, worth, and dignity. ACT1, the billionaire's world. Maxwell Harrington's day began, as it always did, with precision. At exactly 5 a.m., his smart home system gradually increased the lighting in his penthouse bedroom overlooking Central Park. The temperature, which had been lowered for optimal sleep, rose to his preferred 71 degrees. A custom news briefing, curated by his personal AI assistant, began playing through hidden speakers as his automated blinds silently opened to reveal the Manhattan skyline. By 5:30, Maxwell was completing his carefully calibrated workout in his private gym. By 6:15, he was reviewing market reports over a breakfast prepared by his personal chef, cage-free egg whites, organic berries, and a proprietary protein blend developed specifically for his biochemistry. At 42, Maxwell Harrington had achieved what most would consider impossible, building Analytica Core from a coding project in his Stanford dorm room into the world's most sophisticated behavioral prediction engine. His company's algorithms powered everything from social media platforms to global financial markets, predicting human decisions with an accuracy that bordered on the unsettling. The results of this success surrounded him: the $40 million penthouse, the private jet waiting at Teterboro, the fleet of rare cars he rarely drove, the original Picasso hanging casually in his guest bathroom. But more than the possessions, Maxwell valued the deference, the acknowledgement of his exceptional mind, the validation of his core belief that intelligence, particularly his kind of intelligence, was the ultimate human attribute. Your 7:30 call with Tokyo is ready, Mr. Harrington, his executive assistant informed him through the penthouse intercom system. And Dr. Winters from Princeton confirms you're still speaking at tonight's fundraising gala. Maxwell mentally reviewed his schedule as he straightened the custom Brioni suit that had been selected and pressed for today's activities. The Princeton event wasn't something he was particularly enthusiastic about, but the university's computer science department had recently developed several algorithms of interest, and maintaining good relationships with top academic institutions was strategically sound. Confirm Princeton, he responded, and have the car ready at 6 p.m. I'll need the brief on their new CS faculty and the key donors who will be present. The day proceeded with the frictionless efficiency that Maxwell demanded. board meetings where his opinion was treated as near-divine wisdom, development updates from engineers who had learned to anticipate his questions, a lunch with potential, investors who were more interested in being in his presence than in the actual business discussions. By late afternoon, as his driver navigated toward Princeton, Maxwell reviewed the briefing materials on his tablet. The gala was raising funds for the university's new Center for Computational Innovation, a project he had agreed to partially fund, with his name prominently displayed on the main research wing, of course. Anything interesting about this event? He asked his chief of staff, Diane, who accompanied him to manage logistics and ensure every interaction served Maxwell's larger strategic goals. Standard academic fundraiser, Diane replied, not looking up from her own tablet. University president, department heads, wealthy alumni, a few scholarship students to provide inspirational moments. You're the keynote speaker. 20 minutes. On the future of predictive analytics, followed by a Q&A that we've pre-screened. Nothing you haven't done 100 times. Maxwell nodded, already mentally elsewhere. These events were necessary but rarely stimulating. Few people asked questions he hadn't anticipated, offered perspectives he hadn't considered, or challenged his carefully constructed worldview. Oh, Diane added as an afterthought, they've added a student speaker before your address. Someone they're calling non-traditional. Older student, some kind of scholarship recipient. PR thought it might make for good optics if you acknowledged her briefly in your remarks. Details are on page 4. Maxwell flicked to the page, scanning briefly. Sarah Collins, 34, single mother, working toward a degree in information systems. After 10 years in the workforce, recipient of the New Futures Scholarship for returning adult students. Inspirational story? He asked with mild disinterest. The usual, Diane confirmed. Overcoming obstacles, persistence despite challenges, education as the path to opportunity. They eat it up at these events. Maxwell closed the brief. He had heard countless versions of these narratives over the years. Carefully packaged stories of struggle that made privileged donors feel good about their contributions, while reinforcing the comforting belief that the system worked, that merit was eventually rewarded, that the cream inevitably rose to the top. What these stories conveniently overlooked, in Maxwell's view, was the fundamental role of intelligence. Not everyone had the cognitive capacity to succeed in the modern economy. No amount of perseverance could overcome basic intellectual limitations. He had built his entire business on this reality, predicting behavior patterns of the average mind to create algorithms that influence their decisions without their awareness. As the car approached the ornate Gothic architecture of Princeton University, Maxwell adjusted his custom-made titanium cufflinks, each containing a miniature processor running a simplified version of his first successful algorithm, and prepared to play his role in the carefully choreographed performance of philanthropic virtue that awaited him. The Richardson Auditorium was filled to capacity with Princeton's elite, faculty in academic regalia, alumni whose fortunes had built campus buildings, current students selected for their academic promise and future donation potential. Maxwell moved through the pre-event reception with practiced ease, delivering precisely calibrated handshakes, maintaining eye contact for the optimal 4.2 seconds that his own research had determined conveyed both attention and importance, and offering insights just provocative enough to seem profound without risking actual controversy. Mr. Harrington, I can't tell you what an honor it is to have you here, effused Dr. Winters, the rail-thin computer science department chair who had been instrumental in securing Maxwell's donation. Your work on predictive algorithms has revolutionized our field, and of course your generous contribution to our new center will ensure Princeton remains at the forefront of computational innovation. Maxwell offered a modest nod, having long ago perfected the art of appearing humble while being anything but. Princeton has always attracted exceptional minds, he replied. I'm simply ensuring those minds have the resources they need to advance the field. As they continued their circuit of the room, Dr. Winters providing commentary on various attendees, Maxwell's attention was momentarily caught by a woman standing somewhat apart from the main crowd. Unlike the other guests in designer evening wear or academic robes, she wore a simple but elegant blue dress that had the look of something carefully selected from a department store's business section rather than a boutique. She appeared to be in her mid-30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical style, her posture straight but slightly tense, the bearing of someone making a conscious effort to project confidence in unfamiliar surroundings. She was reviewing notes on a small tablet, occasionally glancing up to observe the crowd, before returning to her preparation. "Ah, you've noticed Ms. Collins," Dr. Winters commented, following Maxwell's gaze. "Our student speaker this evening. Quite a remarkable woman, actually. Maintained a perfect 4.0 while working multiple jobs and raising a daughter on her own. Her perspective on applied information systems has been quite impressive. She brings a practical dimension that many of our traditional students lack." Maxwell nodded without comment, his advanced pattern recognition already categorizing Sarah Collins, determined but out of her depth in this environment, intelligent enough to perform well in structured academic tasks, but unlikely to possess the creative brilliance that drove true innovation, hard-working but fundamentally ordinary. Before Dr. Winters could elaborate further, the university president approached to escort Maxwell to his reserved seat in the front row. The event was beginning, and Maxwell Harrington was, as always, the main attraction. 6 hours before stepping into Richardson Auditorium, Sarah Collins' day had begun with a 5:30 a.m. alarm, not in a luxury penthouse, but in a small two-bedroom apartment in Trenton, New Jersey, where the sound of the aging heating system competed with pre-dawn traffic from the nearby highway. "Mom? Is it morning already?" There came a sleepy voice from the bedroom doorway. Sarah looked up from the textbook she'd been reviewing since 4:45 a.m. to see her 11-year-old daughter Lily rubbing her eyes, her dark hair a tangled mess atop her head. "Hey, sweetie, it's early." "You can go back to sleep for another hour," Sarah said, closing her advanced database management text. "I was just getting some studying in before my big day." Lily yawned, but moved to the small kitchen table, sliding into the chair across from her mother. "The fancy speech thing is today, right? The one where you have to dress up?" Sarah nodded, reaching across to smooth her daughter's wayward hair. "That's right. Professor Martinez says it's a big opportunity. Lots of important people who might be interested in my research project." "Will that billionaire guy be there? The one on the magazine cover?" Lily asked, suddenly more alert. "Maxwell Harrington?" "Yes, he's the main speaker," Sarah confirmed, trying to keep her tone neutral, despite her complicated feelings about the tech mogul whose algorithms she had critically analyzed in her most recent research paper. "He's donated a lot of money to the university." Lily's expression grew serious beyond her years. "Just remember what Grandma always says, having money doesn't make anyone better than you." Sarah felt a surge of pride mixed with a familiar ache. Her mother's wisdom continued to shape Lily even 2 years after cancer had taken her. "That's exactly right. Now how about some breakfast before I drop you at Mrs. Patel's for the evening?" The next hours unfolded in the carefully orchestrated dance that Sarah had perfected over years of balancing parenthood, work, and education. Breakfast and lunch preparations for Lily, a quick shower timed to the minute, a remote morning meeting with her part-time consulting clients while simultaneously helping Lily find her missing science project notes, a 45-minute shift, answering customer service calls from her home office setup. At 2:30 p.m., after dropping Lily with their neighbor, Mrs. Patel, who had become like family over the years, Sarah finally had a moment to focus on herself and the evening ahead. She laid her one formal dress on the bed, a navy blue sheath purchased 3 years ago for a job interview and carefully maintained since. It wasn't high fashion, but it was appropriate and professional, complemented by the simple pearl earrings that had been her mother's. As she prepared, Sarah mentally rehearsed her speech. Professor Martinez had selected her to represent the non-traditional student perspective at the fundraising gala, an honor that both thrilled and terrified her. After 10 years working in various administrative and IT support roles, returning to complete her degree had been the hardest decision of her life. The financial strain, the time away from Lily, the constant juggling of responsibilities, all of it had tested her resolve daily. But the opportunity to develop her research on ethical frameworks for data systems had made the struggle worthwhile. Sarah had discovered she had not just an aptitude, but a passion for analyzing how information systems affected real people, particularly those without power or technical knowledge. Her recent work examining the hidden biases in popular prediction algorithms had earned her unexpected attention from the faculty, including, apparently, enough attention to place her on stage at a major fundraising event. Speaking before one of the very architects of those algorithms, as Sarah applied her minimal makeup, she confronted the nervousness that had been building all week. She wasn't naive about her role in tonight's event, the inspiring story of perseverance that would warm wealthy donors' hearts and open their checkbooks. The department needed funding, and her narrative had value in that context, but Sarah had decided that if she was going to be used as an inspirational prop, she would use the platform in return to gently but firmly raise questions about responsibility in technological development, about considering the human impact of algorithmic decisions, about the ethical dimensions that were too often overlooked in the rush toward innovation. She knew it was risky. Maxwell Harrington was not just a major donor, but a legendary figure in the tech world, known as much for his brilliant mind as for his intolerance of what he considered lesser intellects. Challenging his approach, even indirectly, at an event, honoring his contribution was professionally dangerous. But Sarah Collins hadn't survived everything life had thrown at her by avoiding difficult truths. After a final check of her appearance, professional, dignified, but clearly not wealthy, Sarah gathered her notes, the thumb drive containing her presentation, and the tattered copy of her mother's favorite poetry book that she carried to every important event as a talisman. The bus ride from Trenton to Princeton took 45 minutes, during which Sarah continued to refine her remarks, making small adjustments that might help her message resonate without seeming confrontational. The gap between her daily reality and the rarefied world she was about to enter grew more apparent with each mile, as working-class neighborhoods gave way to increasingly manicured estates. By the time she arrived at the historic campus, the sun was setting behind the Gothic spires, casting long shadows across the carefully tended grounds. Students in expensive casual wear strolled past, engaged in conversations about summer plans in Europe or family connections that might secure prestigious internships, conversations that highlighted the parallel universe they inhabited. So different from Sarah's own experience, she checked in at the event registration desk, where she was given a name badge identifying her as both a speaker and a New Futures Scholar, a designation that simultaneously honored her achievement and marked her as different from the standard Princeton community. The pre-event reception was already underway in the ornate lobby of Richardson Auditorium. Crystal chandeliers illuminated clusters of well-dressed attendees, faculty members in academic regalia, alumni in bespoke suits and designer gowns, university administrators expertly working the room to cultivate donor relationships. Sarah found a relatively quiet corner to review her notes one final time, occasionally glancing up to observe the social dynamics unfolding around her. No one approached her, or made any effort to include her in conversations. Whether this was due to her obvious outsider status or simply because they were engaged with people they already knew, the effect was the same. A palpable reminder that despite her academic achievements, she existed on the periphery of this world. She was considering whether to attempt to introduce herself to some of the faculty members from other departments when she noticed a subtle shift in the room's energy. Conversations paused, postures straightened, attention redirected toward the main entrance where a tall, impeccably dressed man had appeared, flanked by what appeared to be personal staff. Even without the reaction of the crowd, Sarah would have recognized Maxwell Harrington instantly. His face was ubiquitous in tech media, the sharp features, penetrating gaze, and expression of perpetual analytical assessment that had graced countless magazine covers and conference keynotes. In person, he projected an aura of absolute certainty, moving through the space as if the very air parted to accommodate his presence. Sarah had studied Harrington extensively as part of her research. His algorithms formed the backbone of systems that made consequential decisions affecting millions of lives, from creditworthiness to hiring probabilities to insurance risk assessments. The mathematical elegance of his work was undeniable, but in her analysis she had identified concerning patterns in how these systems affected vulnerable populations, patterns that suggested the brilliance of the design had not been matched by equivalent consideration of real-world impacts. As she watched him navigate the room with practiced efficiency, Sarah felt a complex mixture of professional admiration and ethical concern. This man had transformed how humanity interacted with technology, creating tools of unprecedented predictive power. Yet he seemed to view people primarily as data points, rather than complex individuals shaped by circumstances beyond algorithmic quantification. The observation strengthened her resolve. Her speech would be respectful but honest, acknowledging the brilliance of innovations while gently highlighting the responsibility that came with such influence. When Dr. Martinez, her faculty advisor, finally approached to escort her backstage, Sarah took a deep breath and reminded herself why she was here. Not just as a representative of non-traditional students or as an inspirational story, but as a voice for those whose lives were increasingly shaped by technologies they neither controlled nor fully understood. People like her neighbors, her clients, her daughter's future self. Nervous, Dr. Martinez asked kindly as they made their way through the back corridors of the auditorium. Sarah smiled, terrified, but ready. "Just be yourself," the professor advised. "Your authentic perspective is exactly why we wanted you to speak tonight." What neither of them could have anticipated was exactly how authentic that perspective would become, or how dramatically it would challenge the carefully constructed world of Maxwell Harrington. The Richardson Auditorium hummed with anticipation as Princeton's president approached the podium to begin the formal program. The audience of over 800, faculty, administrators, major donors, select students, and local business leaders, settled into attentive silence. "Good evening, and welcome to this celebration of innovation and partnership," the president began, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of someone who had delivered countless such addresses. "Tonight, we gather to mark the beginning of an extraordinary new chapter in Princeton's long history of computational excellence." From his front row seat, Maxwell Harrington listened with half his attention, the rest of his mind already considering how he might refine the delivery of his upcoming keynote. The predictable rhythms of academic fundraising events held little interest for him. The obligatory acknowledgements of donors, the carefully curated student success stories, the grandiose pronouncements about the future. All were simply prerequisites to his own address, where he would outline a vision of technological advancement that would justify the substantial donation he had already committed. Before we hear from our distinguished keynote speaker, the President continued, I'm pleased to introduce someone who represents the very heart of Princeton's mission. Sarah Collins exemplifies our belief that extraordinary talent can emerge from any background when given the opportunity to flourish. Maxwell shifted slightly in his seat, recalling the brief mention of the student speaker in his briefing materials. Another inspirational narrative to warm up the crowd, predictable but necessary for the overall flow of the event. Ms. Collins returned to higher education after a decade in the workforce, balancing full-time studies with parenting responsibilities and multiple jobs. She has distinguished herself not merely through perfect academic performance, but through research that challenges us to consider the ethical dimensions of computational innovation. Please welcome Sarah Collins, recipient of the New Futures Scholarship. Polite applause filled the auditorium as Sarah approached the podium. Maxwell observed her with the detached, analytical interest he applied to most people, noting the modest dress, the slight tension in her posture, the way she adjusted the microphone with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making the most of limited time. Good evening, Sarah began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the audience. Thank you, President Matthews, for that kind introduction, and thank you to everyone who supports educational opportunities for students like me, who arrive at Princeton through less conventional paths. Maxwell settled in for what he expected to be a predictable narrative of perseverance, the kind that reinforced the comforting myth that the system worked for those who tried hard enough, regardless of starting point. A story that would make the wealthy donors feel good about their contributions without challenging the fundamental structures that had secured their own advantages. What he heard instead captured his full attention within seconds. We often speak of technology as a great equalizer, Sarah continued, a meritocratic space where brilliant ideas can emerge from anywhere. Yet my experience, both as a working professional and now as a researcher, suggests a more complex reality. The algorithmic systems increasingly shaping our world often reflect and amplify existing social inequalities, not because of deliberate design choices, but because of incomplete consideration of human contexts. Maxwell straightened almost imperceptibly. This was not the standard scholarship recipient speech. This student was addressing the very core of his life's work, predictive technologies and their societal impact. My current research examines how predictive algorithms impact real-world decision-making for non-dominant populations, people without financial or social capital, technical expertise or institutional privilege, Sarah explained, her confidence growing with each word. When we develop systems that categorize humans based on existing patterns, we risk encoding historical inequities into our technological future. In the front row, Maxwell's expression remained neutral, but his mind was racing. This student, this single mother from New Jersey, was articulating a critique of his fundamental approach to algorithm development, one that few established academics had dared to raise in his presence. For example, Sarah continued, activating a slide that displayed anonymized data visualizations. When prediction engines analyze creditworthiness primarily through traditional financial metrics, they systematically disadvantage those who operate largely outside formal banking systems, often immigrants, service workers, and rural communities. The visualization shifted to show comparative outcomes based on zip codes, data that Maxwell immediately recognized as having been derived from analysis of his own company's credit assessment technologies. This isn't about assigning blame, Sarah clarified, as if anticipating the defensive reaction her analysis might provoke. It's about recognizing that even the most brilliant technological innovations exist within social contexts. True computational excellence requires not just mathematical elegance, but robust ethical frameworks that consider the full human impact of our creations. For the next 10 minutes, Sarah presented a concise but remarkably sophisticated analysis of how predictive technologies affected various populations differently. Her examples were meticulously researched, her critiques specific rather than ideological, her suggested approaches practical rather than merely theoretical. Throughout the audience, reactions varied. Many of the older faculty and administrators appeared uncomfortable with such direct questioning of a major donor's work. Younger academics leaned forward with interest. Students tapped notes into their devices, and Maxwell Harrington listened with growing irritation that gradually crystallized into something closer to anger. This scholarship student, with her partial education and limited professional experience, was presuming to critique systems she couldn't possibly fully understand. Systems he had spent decades perfecting. Systems that operated on principles of mathematical optimization that transcended the messy, emotional considerations she was prioritizing. When Sarah concluded her presentation, the applause was solid, but not overwhelming, a reflection of both appreciation for her poise and discomfort with her message in the context of a fundraising event. "Thank you for that thought-provoking perspective, Ms. Collins," President Matthews said as he returned to the podium, his tone carefully modulated to neither endorse nor dismiss her points. "It is precisely this kind of intellectual engagement that makes Princeton a center for multidimensional thinking about technology's role in society." He quickly pivoted to the main event of the evening. "And now it is my distinct honor to introduce our keynote speaker, a visionary whose work has transformed how we understand human behavior and technological possibility. Please welcome the founder and CEO of Analytica Core, Maxwell Harrington." The Dice applause was immediate and enthusiastic as Maxwell rose from his seat and approached the podium with measured confidence. As he passed Sarah, returning to her assigned place in the front row, he gave her a brief, cold glance that communicated his assessment of her presentation more clearly than words could have. Maxwell took his position at the podium, surveying the audience with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to commanding attention. Rather than immediately launching into his prepared remarks, he paused, creating a moment of tension that focused all attention on his next words. "Thank you, President Matthews, for that generous introduction," he began, his voice calm but carrying a subtle edge. "And thank you, Ms. Collins, for that interesting perspective on technological development." The slight emphasis on interesting conveyed his true evaluation, a dismissal wrapped in the thinnest veneer of civility. "Before I share my vision for the future of computational innovation, I feel compelled to address some of the concerns we've just heard," Maxwell continued, deviating from his planned remarks. "It's important that we distinguish between well-intentioned but fundamentally naive critiques and the complex realities of advanced predictive systems." In the front row, Sarah's expression remained composed, though a slight flush colored her cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from the recognition that her work had sufficiently impacted this powerful figure to warrant a direct response. "Predictive algorithms," Maxwell explained, his tone taking on the slightly condescending quality he typically reserved for explaining concepts to non-technical audiences, "are not designed to enforce any particular social outcome. They simply recognize patterns in existing data with unprecedented efficiency. If those patterns reflect societal inequalities, the solution isn't to compromise the mathematical integrity of the systems, but to address the underlying social factors, a task well beyond the scope of technology development." He looked directly at Sarah as he delivered this point, his gaze challenging her to refute this foundational principle of his approach. "While I appreciate the enthusiasm of students exploring these issues," he continued, "we must be careful not to conflate correlation with causation, or to demand that optimization engines solve social problems they were never designed to address. The brilliance of these systems lies precisely in their objectivity, their ability to process information, without the distorting influence of emotional considerations or subjective moral frameworks. Throughout the audience, reactions varied. Many nodded in agreement, particularly those from technical backgrounds who shared Maxwell's prioritization of algorithmic efficiency. Others shifted uncomfortably, sensing the underlying dismissal of valid ethical concerns. The future of computational innovation, Maxwell transitioned, moving toward his prepared remarks, lies not in limiting algorithmic capabilities to accommodate subjective notions of fairness, but in expanding those capabilities to capture ever more complex dimensions of human behavior. What followed was a masterful presentation of Maxwell's vision, a world where predictive technologies anticipated human needs with such precision that the very concept of choice became almost obsolete. His slides displayed dazzling visualizations of interconnected systems operating at global scale, each optimization feeding into others to create unprecedented efficiency in resource allocation, information distribution, and decision support. The technical brilliance was undeniable. The vision was compelling in its elegance and scope, yet underlying it was a fundamental assumption that went largely unexamined, that optimization itself, divorced from explicit value considerations, was an unqualified good. As Maxwell concluded to enthusiastic applause, the event moderator announced that there would be a brief Q&A session with questions that had been submitted in advance and selected by the event organizers. The first few questions were predictably safe. Inquiries about specific technological applications, Maxwell's thoughts on emerging computational methods, his advice for students entering the field. He answered each with practiced eloquence, demonstrating both his technical mastery and his skill at controlling narrative framing. Then came the question that would transform the evening from a standard academic fundraiser into something none of the attendees would ever forget. Our final question, the moderator announced, addresses the intersection of perspectives we've heard tonight. A faculty member asks, how do you respond to concerns that predictive algorithms may systematically disadvantage certain populations due to biases in training data or model design? Maxwell offered a thin smile, recognizing the question as an attempt to find middle ground between his position and the critique offered earlier. He began his response with the confident authority that had become his trademark. This question reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how advanced prediction engines operate, he stated. These systems don't disadvantage anyone. They simply reflect existing patterns with mathematical precision. If certain populations show different outcomes, that's not a failure of the algorithm, but a reflection of objective reality. He continued with increasing intensity, his genuine frustration with what he perceived as technological illiteracy breaking through his usually calculated public persona. The notion that we should compromise predictive accuracy to accommodate subjective notions of fairness represents a dangerous retreat from rational, evidence-based approaches. It suggests that feelings should trump facts, that emotional comfort should outweigh objective optimization. This is the kind of thinking that impedes true innovation. Maxwell's dismissive tone grew more pronounced as he warmed to his subject. The simple truth, which many find uncomfortable but remains true nonetheless, is that different outcomes often reflect different capabilities, different choices, different intrinsic characteristics. Attempting to engineer artificial equality through algorithmic manipulation isn't just mathematically unsound, it represents a kind of intellectual dishonesty. In the front row, Sarah Collins listened with growing disbelief as Maxwell essentially dismissed the entire field of algorithmic fairness and the substantial research demonstrating how prediction systems could perpetuate existing inequalities. When he paused briefly, she found herself raising her hand, despite knowing this wasn't an open forum. The moderator, seeing her gesture and perhaps recognizing an opportunity for engaging discussion, made a split-second decision. It appears Ms. Collins would like to respond. Since her presentation addressed this very topic, perhaps we could hear her perspective. Before anyone could object, he handed a microphone to Sarah, creating an unexpected direct dialogue between the scholarship student and the billionaire keynote speaker. Maxwell's expression flickered with annoyance, but refusing the exchange would appear defensive. He nodded slightly, the gesture both permissive and challenging. Sarah rose, accepting the microphone with calm deliberation. When she spoke, her voice was steady and respectful, but unflinching. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington, for your perspective. I believe we may be talking past each other on a fundamental point," she began. "The issue isn't whether algorithms should reflect reality, it's whose reality they reflect, and whether that reflection is as objective as we assume." She continued with precision that belied her nervousness. For instance, when credit algorithms prioritize traditional banking history, they aren't simply capturing objective reality, they're privileging specific financial behaviors common in certain communities, while devaluing alternative demonstrations of financial responsibility, like consistent rent payments or remittance histories. Throughout the auditorium, a palpable tension built. This was no longer an academic discussion, but a direct challenge to the foundational assumptions of one of the most powerful men in technology. "With respect," Maxwell interrupted, his tone making clear how little respect he actually felt. "This reflects a basic misunderstanding of statistical validity. Predictive accuracy requires focusing on the strongest statistical correlations, not diluting models with weaker indicators to achieve some arbitrary notion of inclusivity." His condescension was now unmistakable. While these concerns may be well-intentioned, they reflect a fundamentally emotional rather than rational approach to system design, perhaps understandable from someone still early in their technical education. The dismissal was clear. She was just a student, just a single mother working multiple jobs, just someone who couldn't possibly understand the complexities that his superior mind had mastered. A murmur ran through the audience. The exchange had crossed from intellectual disagreement into something more personal, more revealing of character. Many shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the underlying dynamic, a powerful man dismissing a woman's expertise by implying emotional, rather than rational thinking, reducing her to her circumstances rather than engaging with her ideas. Sarah's response would be remembered by everyone present long after the details of the technical discussion had faded from memory. Taking a breath, to center herself, she addressed Maxwell directly, her voice calm but carrying a quiet strength that filled the auditorium. "Mr. Harrington, I've studied your algorithms extensively. Their mathematical elegance is undeniable. But mathematics doesn't exist in a vacuum. It operates in a human context," she continued without raising her voice, yet somehow commanding complete attention. "When I was 24, working as an administrative assistant and caring for my infant daughter alone after her father decided parenthood wasn't for him, I applied for a small business loan to start an IT support service for local businesses. Despite perfect credit on my limited history, consistent income, and a solid business plan, I was rejected by 7 banks. The personal narrative had a purpose, connecting abstract concerns to lived reality. Later, through my work, I learned that the prediction engine used by those banks categorized single mothers under 30 as high risk, regardless of their financial behavior, based on aggregate default statistics. Not because we're inherently less responsible, but because unexpected medical bills for children and lack of family safety nets create genuine financial vulnerability. She looked directly at Maxwell, without hostility, but with absolute conviction. That's not objective reality, Mr. Harrington. That's a specific reality shaped by social structures. When we fail to examine these contexts, we don't eliminate bias. We automate it, optimize it, and obscure it behind mathematical complexity. The auditorium had fallen completely silent, hundreds of people collectively holding their breath as the exchange continued. Maxwell's expression had hardened into barely controlled anger. This was not how these events were supposed to proceed. This scholarship student, this waitress-turned-part-time student, was not only challenging his technical perspective, but implicitly questioning his moral framework, his understanding of the very world his systems helped shape. "Your personal experience, while unfortunate, is anecdotal," he replied, his voice tight with restraint. "Systemic decisions can't be based on individual stories or emotional appeals. They require aggregate data and statistical validity. The kind of approach you're advocating would fundamentally compromise predictive accuracy for the sake of feel-good inclusion." He continued with increasing condescension, perhaps sensing the audience's shifting sympathies and attempting to reassert control through intellectual dominance. "Look, I understand that complex mathematical concepts can be challenging for those without advanced training. But the reality is that optimal prediction requires prioritizing the strongest statistical signals, even when those signals create outcomes that might seem unfair from certain perspectives." His tone became increasingly patronizing. In simpler terms, if you're seeing consistently different outcomes across population groups, the rational conclusion isn't that the algorithm is biased, but that there are genuine differences in the underlying behaviors or characteristics being measured. The implication was clear. Some people, some groups, were simply less capable, less responsible, less worthy of opportunity according to objective measures, and those who questioned this conclusion were being emotional rather than rational. Sarah stood motionless, absorbing the full weight of his dismissal. The air in the auditorium seemed to thicken with collective discomfort. Even those who might have agreed with Maxwell's technical position were disturbed by the personal nature of his condescension, the thinly veiled suggestion that her circumstances reflected her inherent worth rather than complex social realities. When she finally responded, her voice was quiet but somehow carried to every corner of the space. "Mr. Harrington, I've maintained a perfect GPA while working 3 jobs and raising my daughter alone. I've built a consulting practice serving small businesses overlooked by major IT firms. I've developed frameworks for ethical data systems that have been adopted by community organizations across New Jersey." Her gaze remained steady, her dignity intact, despite his attempt to diminish her. "I've done all this not because I don't understand complex systems, but because I understand something perhaps more important. That brilliance without compassion, innovation without ethics, optimization without humanity creates technical marvels that fail human needs." Sarah paused, taking in the room's complete attention. "You speak of objective reality as if it exists independent of human experience. But algorithms don't just describe the world, Mr. Harrington. They increasingly shape it, determine who gets opportunities and who doesn't, who is seen as valuable and who remains invisible." Her voice strengthened, not with anger, but with conviction. The truly rational approach isn't to ignore these impacts, but to account for them. The truly brilliant solution isn't to optimize existing patterns, but to help create more equitable ones. The truly innovative path forward isn't to dismiss ethical concerns as emotional distractions, but to integrate them as essential design parameters. Throughout the auditorium, the atmosphere had transformed. What had begun as discomfort with an unexpected confrontation had become collective witnessing of something authentic and powerful. a moment of truth-speaking that transcended the usual carefully scripted interactions of academic fundraising. Maxwell stood rigid at the podium, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. He was unaccustomed to being challenged, particularly by someone he had dismissed as intellectually inferior. His response, when it came, revealed more about him than perhaps he intended. This is precisely the kind of naive idealism that impedes real progress, he said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. The suggestion that we should compromise optimization for sentiment, that mathematical precision should defer to subjective notions of fairness. This represents a fundamental retreat from rational thought into emotional indulgence. He continued with increasing intensity, his carefully constructed public persona cracking to reveal the underlying conviction that had driven his career. That intelligence, particularly his kind of intelligence, was the ultimate measure of human worth. The simple reality, which many find uncomfortable but remains true nonetheless, is that some people make better decisions than others. Some contribute more value than others. Some deserve more opportunities than others. Attempting to engineer artificial equality through algorithmic manipulation isn't just mathematically unsound, it's morally questionable. A collective intake of breath swept through the audience. The mask had slipped, revealing not just a technical disagreement, but a worldview that ranked human value according to a very narrow definition of intelligence and contribution, with Maxwell Harrington, not coincidentally, at the pinnacle of this hierarchy. In the stunned silence that followed, Sarah Collins did something unexpected. She smiled, not with mockery or triumph, but with a kind of compassionate recognition. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Harrington," she said quietly, "because that's the real discussion we should be having, not just about algorithms, but about how we value human beings, about whether we believe certain lives are inherently more worthy than others, but whether opportunity should be allocated based on existing advantage or expanded to nurture potential wherever it exists." She continued with remarkable composure, addressing not just Maxwell, but the entire audience. "I don't claim to have your mathematical brilliance or your extraordinary success, but I've witnessed something that perhaps your privilege has shielded you from: the countless forms of intelligence, resilience, and contribution that exist beyond the narrow metrics our systems currently recognize." Sarah's voice filled the space, not with volume, but with quiet authority born of lived experience. The single mother working multiple jobs while studying at night demonstrates problem-solving skills and determination that no standard assessment captures. The immigrant maintaining family connections across continents shows communication abilities our standard metrics ignore. The minimum wage worker managing a household budget on near-impossible constraints exhibits financial acumen that puts many hedge fund managers to shame. Throughout the auditorium, heads nodded in recognition, not just from students and junior faculty, but from older alumni who had seen enough of life to recognize the truth in her words. True innovation, Sarah concluded, doesn't just optimize existing patterns. It helps create better ones. That requires not just brilliant algorithms, Mr. Harrington, but the humility to recognize that value exists in forms our current metrics don't capture, that intelligence manifests in ways our standardized tests don't measure, that worth isn't determined by market rates or status hierarchies. She looked directly at him without hostility, but with absolute clarity, and that recognition doesn't compromise rationality or progress. It expands them. For perhaps the first time in his public life, Maxwell Harrington found himself without an effective response. His usual tactics, intellectual dismissal, technical obfuscation, status assertion, seemed suddenly inadequate against this woman's simple, powerful truth. The silence lasted only seconds, but felt much longer. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted. Not because Sarah had won an argument, but because she had revealed something fundamental about both human value and the limitations of systems that attempted to quantify it. What happened next would be recounted in different versions by different witnesses, but all would agree on the essential elements. Somewhere in the middle of the auditorium, a single person began to applaud, slow, deliberate claps that echoed in the silence. Others joined, the applause spreading like a wave through the rows until nearly the entire audience was standing. Their response a collective affirmation not just of Sarah's eloquence, but of the essential truth she had articulated. It wasn't an ovation of celebrity worship or polite appreciation, but something rarer and more authentic, recognition of a moment when pretense had been stripped away to reveal something essential about human dignity and worth. On stage, Maxwell Harrington stood rigid, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally a flicker of something that might have been recognition, not just of the public relations disaster unfolding, but perhaps of the limitations of his own worldview. President Matthews stepped quickly to the podium, thanking both speakers for their thought-provoking perspectives and hastily transitioning to closing remarks. But the carefully constructed narrative of the evening had already been irreparably disrupted. Something authentic had broken through the polished veneer of institutional fundraising, and no one who witnessed it would forget. As the formal program concluded and the audience began to disperse, the atmosphere hummed with energized conversation. Faculty members who had remained silent for years about concerns similar to Sarah's now spoke openly. Students clustered in animated groups, many approaching Sarah to express support or share their own experiences with algorithmic bias. And Maxwell Harrington, the man who had arrived as the unquestioned center of attention and authority, stood somewhat isolated near the stage, his usual circle of admirers noticeably diminished. His expression was unreadable, his posture still, rigidly composed, but something had fundamentally shifted in how the room perceived him, not as a visionary whose brilliance transcended ordinary constraints, but as a man whose extraordinary intelligence existed alongside troubling blind spots that reflected and reinforced his own position of privilege. It was a humbling that many would later describe as both necessary and long overdue. Her gaze remained steady, her dignity intact despite his attempt to diminish her. "I've done all this not because I don't understand complex systems, but because I understand something perhaps more important, that brilliance without compassion, innovation without ethics, optimization without humanity creates technical marvels that fail human needs." Sarah paused, taking in the room's complete attention. "You speak of objective reality, as if it exists independent of human experience, but algorithms don't just describe the world, Mr. Harrington. They increasingly shape it, determine who gets opportunities and who doesn't, who is seen as valuable and who remains invisible." Her voice strengthened, not with anger but with conviction. The truly rational approach isn't to ignore these impacts, but to account for them. The truly brilliant solution isn't to optimize existing patterns, but to help create more equitable ones. The truly innovative path forward isn't to dismiss ethical concerns as emotional distractions, but to integrate them as essential design parameters. Throughout the auditorium, the atmosphere had transformed. What had begun as discomfort with an unexpected confrontation had become collective witnessing of something authentic and powerful, a moment of truth-speaking that transcended the usual carefully scripted interactions of academic fundraising. Maxwell stood rigid at the podium, visibly struggling to maintain his composure. He was unaccustomed to being challenged, particularly by someone he had dismissed as intellectually inferior. His response, when it came, revealed more about him than perhaps he intended. This is precisely the kind of naive idealism that impedes Real progress, he said, his voice tight with suppressed anger. The suggestion that we should compromise optimization for sentiment, that mathematical precision should defer to subjective notions of fairness. This represents a fundamental retreat from rational thought into emotional indulgence. He continued with increasing intensity, his carefully constructed public persona cracking to reveal the underlying conviction that had driven his career, that intelligence, particularly his kind of intelligence, was the ultimate measure of human worth. The simple reality, which many find uncomfortable but remains true nonetheless, is that some people make better decisions than others. Some contribute more value than others. Some deserve more opportunities than others. Attempting to engineer artificial equality through algorithmic manipulation isn't just mathematically unsound, it's morally questionable. A collective intake of breath swept through the audience. The mask had slipped, revealing not just a technical disagreement, but a worldview that ranked human value according to a very narrow definition of intelligence and contribution, with Maxwell Harrington, not coincidentally, at the pinnacle of this hierarchy. In the stunned silence that followed, Sarah Collins did something unexpected. She smiled, not with mockery or triumph, but with a kind of compassionate recognition. "Thank you for your honesty, Mr. Harrington," she said quietly, "because that's the real discussion we should be having, not just about algorithms, but about how we value human beings, about whether we believe certain lives are inherently more worthy than others, about whether opportunity should be allocated based on existing advantage or expanded to nurture potential wherever it exists." She continued with remarkable composure, addressing not just Maxwell but the entire audience. "I don't claim to have your mathematical brilliance or your extraordinary success, but I've witnessed something that perhaps your privilege has shielded you from: the countless forms of intelligence, resilience, and contribution that exist beyond the narrow metrics our systems currently recognize." Sarah's voice filled the space not with volume, but with quiet authority, born of lived experience. The single mother working multiple jobs while studying at night demonstrates problem-solving skills and determination that no standard assessment captures. The immigrant maintaining family connections across continents shows communication abilities our standard metrics ignore. The minimum wage worker managing a household budget on near-impossible constraints exhibits financial acumen that puts many hedge fund managers to shame. Throughout the auditorium, heads nodded in recognition, not just from students and junior faculty, but from older alumni who had seen enough of life to recognize the truth in her words. True innovation, Sarah concluded, doesn't just optimize existing patterns, it helps create better ones. That requires not just brilliant algorithms, Mr. Harrington, but the humility to recognize that value exists in forms our current metrics don't capture, that intelligence manifests in ways our standardized tests don't measure, that worth isn't determined by market rates or status hierarchies. She looked directly at him without hostility, but with absolute clarity. And that recognition doesn't compromise rationality or progress, it expands them. For perhaps the first time in his public life, Maxwell Harrington found himself without an effective response. His usual tactics, intellectual dismissal, technical obfuscation, status assertion, seemed suddenly inadequate against this woman's simple, powerful truth. The silence lasted only seconds, but felt much longer. In that moment, the power dynamic in the room had irrevocably shifted, not because Sarah had won an argument, but because she had revealed something fundamental about both human value and the limitations of systems that attempted to quantify it. What happened next would be recounted in different versions by different witnesses, but all would agree on the essential elements. Somewhere in the middle of the auditorium, a single person began to applaud, slow, deliberate claps that echoed in the silence. Others joined, the applause spreading like a wave through the rows until nearly the entire audience was standing. Their response, a collective affirmation not just of Sarah's eloquence, but of the essential truth she had articulated. It wasn't an ovation of celebrity worship or polite appreciation, but something rarer and more authentic, recognition of a moment when pretense had been stripped away to reveal something essential about human dignity and worth. On stage, Maxwell Harrington stood rigid, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and finally a flicker of something that might have been recognition, not just of the public relations disaster unfolding, but perhaps of the limitations of his own worldview. President Matthews stepped quickly to the podium, thanking both speakers for their thought-provoking perspectives and hastily transitioning to closing remarks. But the carefully constructed narrative of the evening had already been irreparably disrupted. Something authentic had broken through the polished veneer of institutional fundraising, and no one who witnessed it would forget. As the formal program concluded and the audience began to disperse, the atmosphere hummed with energized conversation. Faculty members who had remained silent for years about concerns similar to Sarah's now spoke openly. Students clustered in animated groups, many approaching Sarah to express support or share their own experiences with algorithmic bias. And Maxwell Harrington, the man who had arrived as the unquestioned center of attention and authority, stood somewhat isolated near the stage, his usual circle of admirers noticeably diminished. His expression was unreadable, his posture still rigidly composed, but something had fundamentally shifted in how the room perceived him, not as a visionary whose brilliance transcended ordinary constraints, but as a man whose extraordinary intelligence existed alongside troubling blind spots that reflected and reinforced his own position of privilege. It was a humbling that many would later describe as both necessary and long overdue. The morning after the Princeton fundraiser, Sarah Collins woke at her usual early hour in her Trenton apartment, momentarily disoriented by the strange sense that something significant had changed. As consciousness fully returned, the events of the previous evening crashed back into her awareness with startling clarity. Her confrontation with Maxwell Harrington, the unexpected standing ovation, the dozens of people who had approached her afterward, faculty members expressing quiet support, students sharing their own experiences with algorithmic bias, even several wealthy donors who had been genuinely moved by her perspective, and beneath the validation, a creeping anxiety about potential consequences. She had publicly challenged one of the most powerful figures in technology, a major donor to the university where she was still a scholarship student with a degree yet to complete. The professional risk was substantial. Maxwell Harrington was known for neither forgiveness nor restraint when dealing with critics. As Sarah prepared breakfast for Lily, who chatted excitedly about her science project, she checked her phone and found it overflowing with notifications. News of the exchange had spread rapidly through academic and tech circles. Her email inbox contained interview requests from technology publications, meeting invitations from faculty in multiple departments, and, most surprisingly, expressions of support from several ethics researchers at major tech companies. "Mom, why are you famous?" Lily asked suddenly, peering at the continuously lighting phone. Sarah smiled, setting the device aside to focus on her daughter. "I'm not famous, sweetie. I just said something important at an event last night and people are talking about it." "Was it the rich man, the one who thinks he's better than everyone?" Lily asked with the direct insight children often possess. Sarah considered how to respond appropriately. "I met someone who has a different way of seeing the world than we do," she said carefully. He's built amazing technology, but has different ideas about how it should be used and who it should help. Did you set him straight? Lily asked with a grin, echoing a phrase Sarah's mother had often used. Despite her concern about the professional ramifications, Sarah couldn't help laughing. I tried to explain a different perspective. Whether he heard it, that's another question entirely. As Lily headed off to school and Sarah prepared for her morning classes, she had no way of knowing that across Manhattan, the exchange was having an equally significant but very different impact on Maxwell Harrington. For the first time in years, Maxwell had cancelled his morning meetings. He sat in his penthouse office, reviewing video clips of the previous evening that were already circulating widely on social media and tech forums. The visual evidence was unambiguous. The moment when his carefully constructed public persona had cracked, revealing an underlying belief system that ranked human worth according to a narrow definition of intelligence and contribution. More disturbing than the content itself was the public response. Comment sections and professional forums that should have defended his perspective were instead filled with thoughtful critiques, personal stories of algorithmic harm, and expressions of support for the Princeton scholarship mom who had articulated what many had long felt but few had directly stated to someone of his stature. Maxwell had built his career and fortune on understanding human behavior patterns, yet he found himself genuinely surprised by this reaction. In his worldview, optimization and efficiency were self-evident goods that required no moral justification. The suggestion that these values should be balanced against considerations of equity or inclusion had always struck him as emotionally driven rather than rational. Yet watching the video again, he was forced to confront an uncomfortable possibility, that his framework wasn't as objectively rational as he had believed, but rather reflected specific experiences and advantages that had shaped his own path through life. "Sir," his assistant's voice interrupted through the intercom. "The board chair is requesting an urgent call regarding last night's events and the potential impact on company perception." The real-world consequences were already materializing. Analytica Core's stock had opened slightly down as video clips spread. Several long-scheduled media appearances would now inevitably focus on the exchange, rather than Maxwell's preferred messaging about upcoming product launches. Potential clients and partners would have questions about the company's approach to algorithmic fairness and ethical AI. "Schedule the call for noon," Maxwell replied, his voice betraying none of his internal uncertainty. "And get me everything we have on Sarah Collins, full background." While part of his mind turned to damage control and strategic response, another part, a part Maxwell rarely acknowledged, continued to replay not just Sarah's words, but the dignity with which she had delivered them. Despite his attempt to humiliate her through intellectual dismissal, she had maintained a composure and clarity that he was unaccustomed to encountering, particularly from those he considered his intellectual inferiors. The comprehensive background report on Sarah Collins arrived within hours, compiled by Analytica Core's internal research team with the thoroughness they typically applied to competitive intelligence. Sarah Elizabeth Collins, 34. Born in Trenton, New Jersey, to middle class. Parents: father a high school history teacher, mother a nurse, graduated at the top of her high school class, accepted to several prestigious universities, but chose a state school for financial reasons. Married at 22 to James Wilson, a software developer. Daughter Lily, born the following year. Husband left when Lily was 6 months old, subsequently providing minimal and irregular child support. When Sarah's mother was diagnosed with aggressive cancer, Sarah had postponed her education to care for both her mother and infant daughter while working administrative jobs. After her mother's death, she had slowly built a small IT consulting practice serving local businesses, simultaneously taking night classes to complete her degree. The report noted her perfect academic record, her multiple jobs, her volunteer work teaching basic computer skills at community centers. It mentioned the new Futures Scholarship that had finally made it possible for her to attend Princeton part-time while continuing to support her daughter. Nothing in the file suggested radical politics, attention-seeking behavior, or any motivation. Beyond genuine concern about the systems she had studied and experienced firsthand, she was, by all objective measures, exactly what she had appeared to be: exceptionally intelligent, hard-working, and guided by principles that extended beyond personal advancement. As Maxwell reviewed the file, an unexpected emotion surfaced. Something approaching respect mingled with an unfamiliar discomfort that might have been shame, not because Sarah had publicly challenged him, but because his dismissal of her had been based on assumptions about her intelligence and worth that the evidence simply didn't support. Before he could fully process this realization, his phone rang with the scheduled board call. For the next hour, he navigated the concerns of shareholders and executives with his usual strategic precision, outlining a response plan that would address the public relations challenge while protecting the company's core technological approach. Yet, even as he spoke with confidence about messaging adjustments and minor policy refinements, a deeper question had taken root. One that challenged not just Analytica Core's public positioning, but Maxwell's fundamental understanding of his life's work. What if Sarah Collins was right? What if systems optimized purely for predictive accuracy, without explicit consideration of equity or inclusivity, weren't as objectively neutral as he had believed? What if brilliance without ethical frameworks wasn't just incomplete, but potentially harmful? These questions would have seemed absurd to him just 24 hours earlier. Now they persisted, resistant to his usual analytical dismissal of anything that challenged his core assumptions. Meanwhile, across the river in New Jersey, Sarah's day continued with the strange juxtaposition of viral fame and ordinary responsibilities. She attended her database management class, where several students and even the professor referenced the previous night's exchange with varying degrees of directness. She completed her shift at the university IT help desk, fielding calls about password resets and printer configurations, while her phone continuously lit up with messages from journalists and technology ethics researchers. By late afternoon, as she picked up Lily from after-school care, Sarah had made a decision. She would not seek further attention from the incident, would decline interview requests, would focus on completing her degree and developing her research rather than becoming a momentary internet celebrity for challenging a tech billionaire. What she couldn't have anticipated was that the decision about whether the exchange would have lasting impact wasn't entirely hers to make. 3 days after the Princeton event, as Sarah sat in her small home office reviewing client documentation during Lily's weekend soccer practice, her phone rang with an unfamiliar number. "Ms. Collins? This is Diane Mercer, Chief of Staff for Maxwell Harrington." Sarah's stomach tightened. This was the call she had been both expecting and dreading, the powerful man's response to being publicly challenged. While she didn't regret speaking her truth, she was acutely aware of the potential consequences for her academic and professional future. "Mr. Harrington would like to meet with you to continue the discussion that began at Princeton," Diane continued, her tone professionally neutral. "He's available Monday morning at his office in Manhattan, or he can arrange transportation to a location more convenient for you." Sarah hesitated, surprised by both the request and its relatively respectful framing. She had expected either legal threats or silence, not an invitation to further dialogue. "May I ask what specifically Mr. Harrington wishes to discuss?" She inquired carefully. "He believes your exchange raised important questions that deserve more thorough exploration than was possible in that setting," Diane replied with practiced diplomacy. He's particularly interested in your research on alternative indicators of financial responsibility and how they might be incorporated into existing models. The response was so unexpected that Sarah momentarily struggled to process it. Maxwell Harrington wanted to discuss her research, the same research he had essentially dismissed as naive and mathematically unsound just days earlier. "I appreciate the invitation," Sarah said finally, "but my schedule is quite full with coursework and family responsibilities. I would need to know more about the purpose and potential outcomes of such a meeting before I could commit to it." Response reflected both practical reality and appropriate caution. As a single parent with multiple obligations, Sarah couldn't simply rearrange her life for a meeting that might be nothing more than a more private version of the public dismissal she had already experienced. There was a brief pause before Diane continued, her tone shifting subtly. "Ms. Collins, I've worked with Mr. Harrington for 7 years. In that time, I've never known him to reverse his position on a substantive issue or to express interest in a critical perspective once he's dismissed it." Another pause. "Until now. I believe this represents a genuine opportunity for meaningful dialogue that could influence how Analytica Core approaches these questions." The sincerity in the woman's voice gave Sarah pause. If this was truly an opening for impact rather than an attempt at co-optation or damage control, it represented exactly the kind of opportunity she had hoped her work might eventually create. A chance to influence systems that affected millions of lives. "I could meet Wednesday afternoon," Sarah offered cautiously, "but I would need to bring my daughter. She's on half-day release from school, and I don't have alternate care arranged." "That won't be a problem," Diane assured her. "Would 2 p.m. at the Analytica Core headquarters be workable? We can arrange transportation for you both." And so it was arranged. A meeting that neither party could have anticipated just a week earlier, and that would chart an unexpected course for both the brilliant billionaire and the single mother who had dared to challenge his fundamental assumptions about human value and technological purpose. The Analytica Core headquarters dominated a significant portion of a Manhattan block, its gleaming glass facade reflecting the clouds above and the bustling street below. As the company car delivered Sarah and Lily to the main entrance at precisely 2 p.m. on Wednesday, Sarah found herself fighting dual waves of imposter syndrome and protective maternal concern. "Remember what we talked about?" she said quietly to Lily as they approached the security desk. "This is a grown-up meeting, so you'll need to use your quiet activities on your tablet. If you need something, you can whisper to me, but otherwise, "No, Mom," Lily interrupted with the slightly exasperated tone of a child who feels unnecessarily reminded. "I'll be super quiet and super good because this is super important for your research." Sarah smiled, despite her nervousness, once again, struck by her daughter's perceptiveness. She had explained the meeting in age-appropriate terms, that she was sharing ideas with someone who built computer systems that made decisions, and that hopefully those systems might become fairer for everyone as a result. What she hadn't shared was her continued uncertainty about Maxwell Harrington's motives or the potential consequences, both positive and negative, that this meeting might have for their future. After checking in with security, they were escorted to a private elevator that whisked them directly to the executive floor. The doors opened to reveal Diane Mercer waiting to greet them, her professional demeanor softening slightly at the sight of Lily clutching both her tablet and a well-loved stuffed otter. "Ms. Collins, thank you for coming," Diane said, extending her hand. "And you must be Lily. We've set up a comfortable space for you next to the meeting room, with some books and activities, if that's all right with your mother." Lily looked to Sarah for confirmation, receiving a nod before responding with the careful politeness she reserved for important situations. "Thank you very much. I brought my own activities too, and I promised to be quiet." As they followed Diane, Through the sleek, minimalist corridors, Sarah noted the contrast with her usual environments: the cluttered university computer lab, the community center where she volunteered, her own modest apartment filled with Lily's art and schoolwork. Here, every surface was pristine, every element deliberately placed, every detail conveying precision and control. They arrived at a glass-walled conference room where Maxwell Harrington stood reviewing something on a tablet. He looked up as they entered, his expression carefully neutral. Like the space around him, everything about his appearance conveyed deliberate curation. The perfectly tailored suit, the precisely trimmed hair, the posture that suggested both authority and physical discipline. "Miss Collins," he greeted her with a slight nod, his tone professionally courteous rather than warm. "Thank you for making time in your schedule." His gaze shifted briefly to Lily, a flicker of surprise crossing his features, despite having been informed of her presence. "Mr. Harrington," Sarah replied with equal formality. "This is my daughter Lily." To everyone's surprise, Maxwell addressed the child directly, crouching slightly to meet her eye level. "Hello, Lily. I understand you'll be working while your mother and I have our discussion. Is there anything you need to be comfortable?" Lily studied him with the direct, unfiltered assessment unique to children. "No, thank you. I have my books and my drawing app and Otis." She held up the stuffed otter for emphasis. Something almost like a genuine smile flickered across Maxwell's face. "Excellent preparation. That's always the key to success." As Diane showed Lily to the adjacent seating area, visible through the glass wall but sufficiently separate for private conversation, Maxwell gestured Sarah toward the conference table. "I expect you're wondering why I asked for this meeting," he began without preamble, once they were seated. "I have some theories," Sarah replied carefully, "but I'd prefer to hear your explanation directly." Maxwell nodded, acknowledging the response as reasonable. "First, I should clarify that this isn't about damage control or public relations. Our exchange at Princeton has already entered the public domain, and no private conversation will change that reality." He continued with the direct efficiency that characterized his professional reputation. "I've reviewed your academic work more thoroughly since our encounter. Your research on alternative indicators of financial responsibility and their potential integration into prediction models is more substantive than I initially recognized." Coming from Maxwell Harrington, this qualified acknowledgement represented an extraordinary departure from his usual dismissal of critical perspectives. Sarah remained silent, allowing him space to continue. "More specifically," he added, "I've been considering your central critique, that optimization, without explicit ethical frameworks, doesn't eliminate bias, but often obscures and amplifies it. While I'm not prepared to accept that position fully, I recognize it deserves more serious consideration than I've previously given it." He gestured toward a digital display on the wall, which activated to show a series of data visualizations. "These represent outcome analyses from our core prediction engines across different demographic groups. The patterns do show certain systematic divergences that standard accuracy metrics don't capture." For the next 20 minutes, Maxwell outlined specific areas where Analytica Core's algorithms produce significantly different results for different population groups. The presentation was technical, detailed, and remarkably candid about potential problems in systems that formed the backbone of his company's market dominance. Sarah listened intently, occasionally asking clarifying questions or suggesting alternative interpretations of the patterns. The exchange was substantive and professional, two people with different perspectives but genuine expertise examining complex technical questions without posturing or defensive positioning. "The fundamental question," Maxwell eventually concluded, "is whether these divergent outcomes represent accurate prediction based on genuine behavioral differences, as I've previously maintained, or whether they reflect embedded structural biases that a more sophisticated approach might address without compromising overall predictive power. He looked directly at Sarah, his expression serious. Your research suggests the latter. I'm not entirely convinced, but I believe the possibility warrants rigorous investigation. Sarah considered her response carefully, recognizing both the significance of this opening and the importance of not overplaying her position. I appreciate your willingness to examine these questions, she said finally. My research suggests that alternative data sources and modified weighting approaches could actually enhance predictive accuracy while reducing differential impacts across groups, not as a compromise between accuracy and fairness, but as an advancement that serves both objectives. She leaned forward slightly, warming to her core argument. The key insight isn't that we should deliberately engineer equal outcomes regardless of underlying patterns. It's that our current measures capture only a narrow slice of relevant behaviors, systematically missing important signals from populations that operate outside dominant financial and social systems. To illustrate her point, Sarah pulled up specific examples from her research. Cases where traditional credit scoring missed strong indicators of financial responsibility evident in alternative data sources. Instances where cultural or circumstantial differences created the appearance of different risk profiles when the underlying reliability was actually comparable. Throughout her presentation, Maxwell listened with an intensity that was almost unsettling. His complete attention focused on understanding her argument rather than formulating his response. This, Sarah realized, was a glimpse of the intellectual capacity that had built his empire, the ability to process complex information rapidly and identify core principles beneath surface details. What you're proposing, he said when she had finished, isn't just an ethical overlay on existing systems. It's a fundamental rethinking of how we define and measure the behaviors we're attempting to predict. Sarah nodded. Exactly. It's not about compromising mathematical rigor for social considerations. It's about bringing greater mathematical sophistication to bear on the full complexity of human behavior, including dimensions our current metrics systematically overlook. For the first time, a genuine smile appeared on Maxwell's face. Not the practiced expression he deployed for media appearances, but something rarer and more authentic. The smile of someone encountering an idea that challenged his thinking in precisely the way his intellect craved. You've made a compelling initial case, he acknowledged. Not a conclusive one, but certainly strong enough to warrant serious exploration. He tapped his tablet, pulling up a new document, which brings me to the actual purpose of this meeting. Maxwell outlined a proposal that took Sarah completely by surprise. Analytica Core would fund a 6-month research project to formally test her approaches using the company's vast data resources and computational infrastructure. She would lead the project as a visiting researcher, with full academic freedom to publish her findings regardless of the outcome. The position would include appropriate compensation, he added, naming a figure that was several times Sarah's current combined income from her various jobs, and a flexible schedule that accommodates your academic and family responsibilities. The offer was simultaneously extraordinary and concerning. The resources Maxwell was offering would allow Sarah to pursue her research at a scale she had never imagined possible, potentially influencing systems that affected millions of lives. Yet she was acutely aware of the power differential and the potential for her work to be co-opted or controlled. This is unexpected, she said carefully, and generous in its resources. But I would need to understand more about the parameters and expectations. I won't compromise my academic independence or the integrity of my analysis. I would expect nothing less, Maxwell replied, his tone suggesting this commitment to integrity was precisely what made her work valuable. The formal agreement would include explicit protections for your intellectual freedom and ownership of your research. Analytica Core would have implementation rights, but not editorial control over your findings or publications. He continued with unexpected candor. To be completely transparent, Ms. Collins, this arrangement serves multiple purposes. Yes, there's potential business value in developing more sophisticated prediction models. Yes, there's some reputational benefit in demonstrating commitment to algorithmic fairness. His expression became more serious. But beyond those considerations, our exchange at Princeton forced me to confront questions I've too easily dismissed. Throughout my career, whether you're ultimately right or wrong about the specific technical approaches, you've identified a blind spot in how I've conceptualized these systems. That blind spot warrants rigorous examination, not defensive dismissal. Sarah studied him carefully, looking for signs of insincerity or strategic manipulation. What she saw instead was something she hadn't expected. A genuine intellectual curiosity that, perhaps for the first time, extended beyond mathematical optimization to include the human contexts in which his technologies operated. "I'll need to review the formal agreement with an independent attorney," she said finally, "and discuss the implications with my daughter. This would represent a significant change for both of us." "Of course," Maxwell agreed. "Take whatever time you need to consider the proposal properly. The offer remains open regardless of your decision." About today's meeting, as if on cue, a small voice interrupted from the doorway where Lily stood, apparently having completed her activities. "Mum, I finished my science questions and my drawing. Can I show Mr. Harrington my picture? It's of his building, but with improvements." Sarah glanced at Maxwell, who nodded his assent, seeming genuinely curious about what a child might consider. Improvements to his architecturally acclaimed headquarters. Lily approached confidently, holding up her tablet to display a surprisingly detailed digital drawing of the Analytica Core building, but with significant modifications. She had added gardens on multiple levels, colorful community spaces visible through the glass walls, and what appeared to be a playground on the roof. "See, it's still very fancy and important," she explained earnestly to Maxwell, "but now it's also friendly and has places where people can grow things, and children can visit their parents at work." She pointed to specific features with the seriousness of a professional presenter, and these solar panels make electricity while also giving shade to the garden areas. Maxwell studied the drawing with unexpected attention, asking Lily questions about her design choices with the same focus he typically reserved for technical discussions with his senior engineers. The child answered with unfiltered honesty, explaining that buildings should be smart and kind, a phrase that seemed to strike Maxwell with particular force. As Sarah watched their interaction, she realized she was witnessing something significant. Not just a powerful man being polite to a child, but a genuine moment of perspective shifting. Lily's unfiltered imagination and straightforward values were penetrating psychological defenses that sophisticated academic arguments might never breach. When they eventually concluded the meeting and prepared to leave, Maxwell walked them to the elevator himself, rather than delegating the task to Diane, a small but notable departure from his usual protocol. "Thank you for your time today, Ms. Collins," he said formally as they waited for the elevator. "I look forward to your decision." About the research proposal, then, more surprisingly, he addressed Lily directly once more. "And thank you for your architectural suggestions, Lily. You've given me some important things to consider about how this building serves its purpose." As the elevator doors closed and they began their descent, Lily looked up at her mother with the direct insight children sometimes possess. "He's not as mean as you thought, Mum. He's just lonely in his big building with no gardens." Sarah smiled, struck once again by her daughter's perceptiveness. "I think you might be right, sweetie. Sometimes people who are very smart forget about other important things, like kindness and trees and playgrounds," Lily suggested. "Exactly like that," Sarah agreed, realizing that perhaps the most powerful argument for her ethical framework had come not from her research or presentations, but from her daughter's simple reminder that buildings, like algorithms, should be both smart and kind. Aced 6. Transformation and Impact. Over the following 6 months, what began as an unexpected meeting evolved into an even more unexpected collaboration. After thorough review of the formal agreement with an attorney provided by Princeton's legal clinic, Sarah accepted the position as visiting researcher at Analytica Core, with carefully structured terms that protected her academic independence, while providing unprecedented access to data and computational resources. The practical arrangements reflected Maxwell's genuine commitment to making the opportunity workable within Sarah's complex life. She was provided dedicated workspace at Analytica Core's Manhattan headquarters, but allowed to work remotely 3 days a week from Princeton's campus or her home. The compensation package included not just salary, but support services that addressed the logistical challenges of single parenthood, reliable transportation, emergency childcare options, and flexibility for school events and medical appointments. For the first time in years, Sarah was able to focus her full intellectual energy on her research without the constant strain of financial insecurity and logistical complexity. She withdrew from her multiple part-time jobs, maintained her academic schedule, and found herself with actual time to spend with Lily beyond the bare essentials of daily care. The research itself progressed from theoretical models to practical implementation, with the kind of rapid iteration only possible with significant resources. Sarah assembled a small team of data scientists and ethicists, carefully selected for both technical expertise and diverse lived experiences. Together, they developed and tested alternative approaches to prediction that incorporated a wider range of behavioral indicators and contextual factors. The results surpassed even Sarah's optimistic projections. By integrating alternative financial indicators, consistent payment of utility bills, cell phone plans, and rent, responsible management of informal lending networks, stability of income regardless of source, their models achieved predictive accuracy equal to or better than traditional approaches, while dramatically reducing outcome disparities across demographic groups. Maxwell's involvement evolved in ways neither had initially expected. While he maintained appropriate professional boundaries, his intellectual engagement with the project was genuine and substantive. He regularly joined research discussions, offering technical insights while demonstrating increasing openness to perspectives he would have dismissed just months earlier. More surprisingly, he began accompanying the team on field research trips, visiting community financial institutions in Trenton, attending technology access workshops at the centers, where Sarah volunteered, even spending time in the neighborhoods where traditional banking was scarce, but complex financial management skills were nonetheless evident in how residents navigated limited resources. These direct encounters with realities outside his usual experience visibly affected him, not with dramatic emotional displays or sudden personality transformations, but with a gradual integration of new understanding into his analytical framework. He began asking different questions, considering different factors, acknowledging different forms of expertise, including the expertise that came from lived experience rather than formal credentials. The project's results began generating attention within Analytica Core and beyond. Initial implementations showed that the modified algorithms not only reduced outcome disparities, but identified viable customers and opportunities that traditional approaches had systematically missed. What had begun as an ethics-focused research project was demonstrating tangible business value, creating the potential for genuine system-level change. Throughout this period, an unexpected friendship developed between Maxwell and Lily. What had begun with her straightforward architectural critique of his building evolved into a kind of mutual education, the child's unfiltered perspective challenging the billionaire's assumptions in ways no adult could, and his analytical mind taking her ideas seriously in ways that nurtured her confidence and critical thinking. When Lily's school science fair approached, Maxwell surprised both mother and daughter by offering to help with her project, not by taking over or providing ready-made solutions, but by asking thoughtful questions that helped Lily refine her own ideas and approach. The project, a study of how different plants could filter water pollutants, inspired by a community garden in her neighborhood, won first place, with Lily proudly explaining complex biological processes to judges and visitors alike. "Mr. Max helped me design my experiment," she told everyone who asked. "But I did all the work and figured out all the results myself." The pride in her voice reflected not just the achievement itself, but the growing confidence of a child whose ideas were being taken seriously by adults with real power and influence. For Sarah, watching this interaction provided a window into capacities Maxwell possessed but rarely displayed in his professional life: patience, genuine curiosity about perspectives different from his own, and the ability to value forms of intelligence beyond the narrow analytical skills he had long prioritized. As the 6-month research period neared its conclusion, the team prepared for a major presentation to Analytica Core's executive leadership and board of directors. The stakes were significant. This would determine whether their approaches would be implemented in the company's core products or remain academic explorations without real-world impact. The evening before the presentation, Sarah found herself working late at Analytica Core headquarters, finalizing slides and rehearsing key points. Lily was spending the night with Mrs. Patel, allowing Sarah to focus completely on the culmination of 6 months' intensive work. She was surprised when Maxwell appeared at her office door around 9 p.m., having assumed he had long since departed. "Still here?" he asked, his tone casual in a way that would have been unimaginable during their first tense encounters. Sarah nodded, gesturing to the multiple displays showing different sections of their presentation. "Just making sure everything is perfect. For tomorrow, there's a lot riding on this." Maxwell entered the office, studying the visualizations with his characteristic analytical focus. "The data is compelling. The methodology is sound. The business case is strong." He turned to face her directly. "Are you concerned about something specific?" Sarah hesitated, then decided on honesty. "I'm concerned about whether any of this will matter if the people with decision-making power don't fundamentally value the problems we're trying to solve." It was the question that had lingered beneath their entire collaboration: whether technical solutions, however elegant, could address issues that stemmed from underlying value systems and power structures. Maxwell was quiet for a moment, considering her words with unusual thoughtfulness. When he finally spoke, his response surprised her. 6 months ago, I would have dismissed that concern as irrelevant emotionalism," he admitted. "I believed that objective optimization was inherently valuable, regardless of how the resulting efficiencies were distributed." He moved to the window overlooking the nighttime city, a landscape of light and shadow, privilege and exclusion, opportunity and constraint. "I still believe in the power of optimization," he continued. But I've come to recognize that what we choose to optimize for reflects values that are neither objective nor universal. Those choices have consequences that technical elegance alone cannot justify. He turned back to Sarah, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. Tomorrow isn't just about convincing the board that your approaches achieve better technical results. It's about challenging fundamental assumptions about what better actually means. Sarah was struck by the evolution this statement represented. Not a complete transformation of Maxwell's worldview, but a significant expansion that created space for considerations he had previously rejected as irrelevant. "Are you prepared for that kind of challenge?" she asked directly. It questions not just specific algorithmic choices, but the foundational principles of how you've built your company and career. Maxwell's response was both honest and revealing. "I built Analytica Core to make systems smarter. I defined smart in very specific, measurable ways that aligned with my own capabilities and values." A slight smile crossed his features. "Your daughter regularly reminds me that things should be smart and kind. I'm beginning to think she's identified a critical optimization parameter I've been missing." The next morning, the Analytica Core boardroom filled with the company's most senior executives and board members, individuals whose collective wealth and power represented the pinnacle of technology industry success. They had gathered to evaluate research that fundamentally challenged how that success had been defined and achieved. Sarah stood at the front of the room, her presentation polished, but her stomach tight with the knowledge that this audience had the power to either implement her team's findings at global scale or relegate them to academic footnotes. What she hadn't expected was for Maxwell Harrington to open the session not with polite introduction, but with direct challenge to his own leadership team. "Before Ms. Collins presents her team's findings," he began, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had built a technology empire, "I want to frame today's discussion in terms of first principles." The room fell completely silent. Executives and board members alike recognizing that something significant was occurring. Analytica Core has defined success through a very specific lens, Maxwell continued. "We've prioritized predictive accuracy, computational efficiency, and implementation scale, metrics that align with technical excellence as traditionally defined. Those priorities have created extraordinary shareholder value and market dominance." He paused, his gaze moving deliberately around the room. "What they have not done, what I have not done, is sufficiently consider the differential impacts of our systems on populations already marginalized by existing social structures. I have dismissed concerns about algorithmic fairness as emotional distractions from rational optimization. I have privileged efficiency over equity. I have mistaken a specific kind of intelligence for universal human value." The executives exchanged glances, clearly uncertain how to respond to this unexpected self-critique from a founder known for unwavering confidence in his approach. "The research you're about to see," Maxwell concluded, "doesn't just propose technical refinements to our existing approaches. It challenges us to expand our definition of what constitutes technological excellence and business success. I ask you to consider it not as a compromise of our standards, but as an evolution of them." With that extraordinary introduction, he yielded the floor to Sarah, whose presentation now carried even greater significance than she had anticipated. For the next hour, Sarah and her team presented their findings with the precision and clarity that complex technical material required. They demonstrated how their modified algorithms achieved comparable or superior predictive power while dramatically reducing outcome disparities. They showed how incorporating alternative indicators expanded viable customer bases in previously underserved markets. They outlined implementation pathways that would allow gradual integration without disrupting existing operations. Throughout the presentation, Maxwell remained silent but attentive, allowing the research to stand on its own merits rather than relying on his authority to drive acceptance. This itself represented a significant evolution, a willingness to create space for other voices rather than dominating every discussion. When the formal presentation concluded, the questioning began, detailed, technical, occasionally skeptical, but fundamentally engaged with the substance, rather than dismissive of the underlying concerns. These were, after all, individuals who had risen to their positions through intellectual capacity and analytical rigor. When presented with compelling evidence and sound methodology, they were capable of reconsidering established approaches. The Chief Financial Officer raised questions about implementation costs and revenue implications. The Chief Technology Officer probed the technical architecture required to incorporate new data sources. The Chief Legal Officer explored regulatory considerations and potential liability issues. Sarah and her team addressed each question directly, having anticipated most concerns and prepared thorough responses. Where genuine uncertainties existed, they acknowledged them transparently rather than offering false confidence. As the discussion progressed, something remarkable occurred. A gradual shift from skepticism to engagement, from critique to collaboration, as the executives began building on the team's ideas rather than merely questioning them. The decisive moment came when the most senior board member, a venture capitalist known for ruthless focus on financial returns, posed what everyone recognized as the essential question. "This all sounds admirable," he said, his tone neither dismissive nor enthusiastic. "But ultimately, we answer to shareholders who care about growth and profitability. Why should Analytica Core implement approaches that potentially constrain optimization for the sake of more equitable outcomes? What's the business case beyond good publicity?" Before Sarah could respond, Maxwell stepped forward, not to override her answer, but to address a question that fundamentally challenged his own previous position. "Three considerations," he said, his response structured with his characteristic precision. "First, as the data clearly shows, these approaches actually expand viable markets by identifying qualified customers our current systems systematically exclude. That's not constraint, it's more sophisticated optimization," he continued with growing conviction. "Second, regulatory frameworks are evolving rapidly in this space. Companies that proactively address algorithmic fairness will maintain freedom to innovate, while those that resist will face increasing constraints. That's not ideology, it's strategic positioning." His final point, however, departed from purely strategic calculation. Third, and perhaps most important, talent. The next generation of computational innovators, like Ms. Collins and her team, increasingly demand that their work create value that extends beyond shareholder returns. Companies that align with these values will attract the brilliant minds that drive future growth. He glanced at Sarah before delivering his conclusion. "This isn't about compromising excellence for social considerations. It's about recognizing that excellence itself must be more comprehensively defined if we're to remain leaders in an evolving landscape." The room fell silent as the board members and executives absorbed this unexpected perspective from a founder whose single-minded focus on traditional metrics had built their collective fortunes. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds, the board chair spoke. "I believe we've heard sufficient evidence to move forward with initial implementation. The executive team will develop a phased rollout plan with quarterly evaluation against both traditional and expanded success metrics. With those words, 6 months of research and a lifetime of Sarah's experience and insight gained the potential for systemic impact. Algorithms that would shape millions of financial decisions, employment opportunities, and resource allocations would now incorporate a broader understanding of human behavior and value, not as charity or compromise, but as more sophisticated optimization. As the meeting concluded and attendees dispersed, Sarah found herself momentarily alone with Maxwell in the boardroom. The setting echoed their first public encounter at Princeton, but with their positions now fundamentally transformed, not into friendship exactly, but into a complex collaboration built on growing mutual respect. "Thank you," she said simply, "not just for today, but for being willing to reconsider fundamental assumptions. That's rare, especially for someone who's been so successful within existing paradigms." Maxwell's response was characteristic in its directness, but surprising in its content. "I built an empire predicting human behavior," he said, "yet somehow failed to recognize how my own thinking was shaped by specific experiences and advantages. That's not just a moral failing, but an intellectual one." He gathered his materials, preparing to leave for his next meeting. "We haven't solved all the problems, not even close, but we've created space for different questions, different metrics, different voices. That's a start." As Sarah watched him depart, she reflected on the journey from that first confrontation to this moment of qualified triumph. There had been no dramatic conversion narrative, no complete transformation of Maxwell Harrington from tech oligarch to social justice advocate. That would have been neither realistic nor necessary. What had occurred instead was something both more subtle and more substantial, an expansion of perspective that created space for different kinds of value and different forms of expertise, to influence systems with far-reaching impact. Not revolution, but evolution with genuine consequence. Act 7. The Ripple Effect. A year after the Princeton confrontation that had unexpectedly changed both their trajectories, Sarah Collins stood at a different podium in a different auditorium. This time, she wasn't an unexpected addition to someone else's event, but the featured speaker at the inaugural Conference on Ethical Computation, jointly sponsored by Princeton University and the newly established Analytica Core Foundation for Inclusive Innovation. The audience included academic researchers, industry practitioners, policymakers, and community advocates, an unusual mix that reflected the conference's mission to bridge traditional divides between technical expertise and lived experience, between theoretical elegance and practical impact. Sarah's keynote address wasn't focused on her own journey, but on the practical outcomes of implementing more inclusive predictive models across multiple domains. The data showed significant positive impacts: increased access to financial services in previously underserved communities, more diverse hiring outcomes in organizations using modified screening algorithms, and more equitable resource allocation in public systems, ranging from education to healthcare. These aren't just feel-good metrics, Sarah emphasized, addressing the skepticism still common in technical circles. They represent more sophisticated optimization that captures value traditional approaches systematically miss. The mathematical elegance is in their greater comprehensiveness, not in their simplified abstractions. From her position at the side of the stage, Sarah could see Lily in the front row, now 12, and increasingly confident in academic settings. Beside her sat Mrs. Patel, whose childcare support had made Sarah's work possible, and whose own experiences as an immigrant entrepreneur had informed key elements of their alternative assessment models. More surprising was the figure seated next. To them, Maxwell Harrington, without entourage or fanfare, simply present as both supporter and participant. His role in the day's proceedings would come later, not as keynote, but as one participant in a panel discussion on industry implementation of ethical frameworks, a deliberate positioning that created space for diverse voices rather than centering his authority. As Sarah concluded her address to enthusiastic applause, she reflected on the changes the past year had brought, not just to her professional circumstances, but to the broader conversation about technology's role in society. The research collaboration that had begun as a 6-month project had evolved into the Center for Inclusive Computation, jointly funded by Analytica Core and a consortium of academic institutions. Sarah now served as its executive director, leading a diverse team of researchers, practitioners, and community liaisons in developing and implementing more equitable computational approaches across multiple domains. Maxwell's evolution had been equally significant, if less publicly visible. While still CEO of Analytica Core, he had gradually shifted both his leadership approach and the company's strategic priorities. Technical brilliance remained essential, but it was now evaluated within broader frameworks that considered diverse impacts and perspectives. The company's core products had been systematically modified to incorporate the team's findings, not as separate ethical overlays, but as integral elements of their computational architecture. These changes had initially generated skepticism from traditional stakeholders, but the business results, expanded markets, regulatory advantages, talent attraction and retention, had gradually converted pragmatic consideration into genuine commitment. More personally, Maxwell had developed what might cautiously be called a friendship with Sarah and Lily, not the close intimacy of shared daily life, but a genuine connection based on mutual respect and complementary perspectives. He had become a regular visitor to the Community Technology Center where Sarah volunteered, eventually establishing a foundation that provided sustainable funding without controlling oversight. Most significantly, he had begun the difficult work of reconsidering fundamental assumptions that had shaped his understanding of human value and contribution. This wasn't a dramatic personality transformation, but a gradual expansion of perspective, an intellectual evolution consistent with his self-identity as someone who followed evidence rather than ideology. The conference itself represented this evolution in microcosm. As the day progressed through panels, workshops, and networking sessions, the usual hierarchies of academic settings were subtly reconfigured. Community advocates spoke with the authority of relevant expertise rather than token inclusion. Technical discussions incorporated consideration of social contexts as essential parameters rather than external constraints. Different forms of knowledge and experience were valued for their complementary insights, rather than ranked in predetermined hierarchies. During an afternoon break, Sarah found herself momentarily alone with Maxwell on the terrace overlooking the Princeton campus, both taking a brief respite from the intense discussions inside. "Your presentation was compelling," Maxwell observed, his assessment professional but genuine. "The 2-year implementation data is particularly persuasive." "For the skeptics," Sarah nodded, recognizing the importance of empirical validation for those whose worldview prioritized quantitative measurement. The expanded market access metrics should help with the purely business-focused audience as well. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both considering how far their unexpected collaboration had progressed from that first confrontational exchange. "Lily mentioned she's been accepted to the Advanced Science program," Maxwell said finally. "That's impressive." Sarah smiled with maternal pride. "Yes, she's thrilled. The scholarship makes it possible for her to participate fully. She'll have access to the same opportunities as students from much more privileged backgrounds." Maxwell's response was thoughtful. "That's what all this is really about, isn't it? Not just abstract fairness or theoretical equity, but actual human beings, with potential that might otherwise be missed or wasted. It was perhaps the clearest articulation of how his perspective had evolved, from abstract optimization to recognition of the specific human impacts of system design choices. "That's exactly it," Sarah agreed. "Every time we design systems that miss potential or overlook value because it doesn't fit our predetermined metrics, we all lose, not just those directly affected, but society as a whole." As they prepared to return to the conference sessions, Maxwell paused, seeming to consider something carefully before speaking. "I've been thinking about our first encounter," he said finally, "about how close I came to missing what you had to offer because it didn't fit my preconceptions of valuable contribution." The admission was notable both for its content and for the fact that Maxwell Harrington, a man whose career had been built on projecting absolute certainty, was acknowledging limitation and growth. "We all have blind spots," Sarah offered, neither minimizing his past dismissiveness nor holding it against his present self. "The question is whether we're willing to reconsider when presented with evidence that challenges our assumptions." Maxwell nodded, accepting this framing. The mathematically elegant solution isn't always the one that looks simplest at first glance. Sometimes it requires incorporating additional variables that complicate the equation, but ultimately produce more comprehensive results. It was classic Maxwell, translating human considerations into the technical language that formed his primary framework. But the translation itself represented growth, an integration of considerations he had previously dismissed as irrelevant to rigorous analysis. The final session of the conference featured a panel discussion on implementing ethical frameworks in existing technological systems, the practical challenges of moving from theoretical commitment to operational reality. Maxwell participated not as moderator or featured expert, but as one voice among several, including industry peers, regulatory experts, and community advocates. When asked about the business case for implementing more inclusive algorithms, his response reflected both pragmatic strategy and evolving values. "There are compelling competitive advantages," he acknowledged, addressing the business leaders in the audience. "Expanded viable markets, regulatory positioning, talent acquisition and retention, all tangible benefits to the bottom line." But he didn't stop there, continuing with unusual candor. "However, focusing exclusively on those advantages misses something more fundamental. The purpose of prediction isn't just precision in abstract mathematical terms, it's accuracy in mapping and serving genuine human needs and potential. When our systems systematically overlook certain forms of value or potential because they don't fit our predetermined metrics, that's not just a moral failing, but a technical one." He glanced briefly toward Sarah and Lily in the audience before concluding, "The most sophisticated optimization isn't the one that forces reality to conform to our models, but the one that expands our models to more fully encompass reality in all its complexity. That's not just good ethics, it's good mathematics." As the conference concluded and attendees dispersed, some to implement new approaches in industry settings, others to continue research in academic contexts, still others to apply insights in community organizations, Sarah reflected on the ripple effects of that initial confrontation at Princeton. What had begun as a single moment of truth-speaking had expanded into networks of influence and implementation that were gradually reshaping how computational systems interacted with human lives and communities. Not through dramatic revolution, but through persistent evolution. Challenging assumptions, expanding metrics, including diverse perspectives in design processes that had previously excluded them. The changes weren't universal or complete. Many technology leaders and institutions continued to prioritize narrow optimization without consideration of broader impacts. Algorithmic systems still reflected and reinforced existing power structures and resource distributions in countless domains. But something had shifted in the conversation, a widening of what was considered relevant, an expansion of whose expertise was valued, a growing recognition that technical excellence itself required more comprehensive understanding of the contexts in which technology operated. As Sarah gathered her materials and prepared to join Lily and Mrs. Patel for their journey home, she was approached by a young woman who had been quietly observing throughout the conference. "Ms. Collins, I just wanted to thank you," the woman said, her voice reflecting nervous determination. "I'm a single mother working in data science while finishing my degree. Seeing you lead this work, hearing your story, it matters. It shows that our perspectives aren't just relevant, but essential." Sarah recognized in this brief exchange the most meaningful outcome of the past year's work. Not just algorithmic modifications or institutional partnerships, but the creation of pathways for others whose perspectives and talents might otherwise remain unrecognized and undervalued. "Thank you for being here," she responded sincerely. "Your perspective is exactly what this field needs, not instead of technical rigor, but as an essential element of it." As the young woman continued toward her next session, Lily appeared, at Sarah's side, having witnessed the exchange. "She's like you were, isn't she?" Lily observed with her characteristic perceptiveness. "Working and studying and trying to make things better." Sarah nodded, putting an arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Yes, she is. And hopefully her path will be a little easier because of the work we've been doing." Lily considered this with serious concentration. "So it's like a chain reaction? You stood up to Mr. Max, and that changed how he thinks, and that changed his company, and now lots of people are thinking differently?" "Something like that," Sarah agreed, once again struck by her daughter's ability to distill complex situations to their essence. Small actions can create larger changes over time, especially when they help people see things they weren't noticing before. As they made their way toward the exit, they passed Maxwell engaged in conversation with several conference attendees. He nodded briefly in acknowledgement, the gesture containing recognition of their shared journey from confrontation to collaboration. It wasn't a fairy tale ending of complete transformation or perfect resolution. Maxwell Harrington remained in many ways the same brilliant, demanding, occasionally arrogant technology leader he had always been. The systems he had built still wielded enormous influence that required ongoing critical engagement and oversight. But something fundamental had shifted, not just in one man or one company, but in the broader conversation about technology's role in society. New voices were being heard. New metrics were being valued, new possibilities were being recognized, and it had begun with a single mother finding the courage to speak truth to power, to stand firm in her dignity when faced with dismissal, to offer not just critique, but constructive alternatives grounded in both technical understanding and lived experience. In that moment of public humiliation, transformed into public acknowledgement of deeper truth, something had changed, not just for Sarah Collins and Maxwell Harrington, but for all those who witnessed it and all those who would benefit from its ripple effects across technologies that increasingly shaped human opportunity and potential. The story of Sarah Collins and Maxwell Harrington reminds us that transformative change often begins in unexpected moments of authentic encounter, when carefully constructed hierarchies of value and expertise are momentarily disrupted, creating space for new understanding to emerge. It reminds us that speaking truth to power requires not just courage, but the ability to offer constructive alternatives, to challenge not just what is wrong, but to illuminate what could be better. Most importantly, it reminds us that genuine dignity cannot be granted or taken away by external validation or dismissal. It exists inherently in each human being, regardless of circumstance or status, waiting only to be recognized and respected. In a world increasingly shaped by technological systems that embed specific values and priorities, we need both brilliant innovation and ethical frameworks that ensure that innovation serves genuine human flourishing in all its diversity. We need both optimization and consideration of what we're optimizing for, and whose experiences and needs are included in those calculations. The applause that erupted in that auditorium wasn't just for Sarah Collins' eloquence or courage. It was recognition of a deeper truth about human value and dignity that resonated beyond that specific moment. A truth that, once acknowledged, creates ripples of change that extend far beyond their original source. If this story has touched your heart and made you reflect on how we value different forms of intelligence, contribution, and worth, please subscribe to our channel for more stories that illuminate the complex intersection of technology, humanity, and social change. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and remember, true innovation requires both brilliance and humanity, both optimization and consideration of its human impact. Our greatest technological achievements will ultimately be measured not just by their computational elegance, but by how they recognize, support, and enhance human dignity in all its forms. Until next time, this is Channel Name, bringing you the stories that inspire, challenge, and connect us all.